Yes, thank you, Mika. So I want to start with Lawson and give the floor to you.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I think Mika and his team are attempting to, of course, address the complexity of the Arctic. And here at the beginning of the 21st century, we have clearly profound climate change, and that's every event we go to, we hear about. But we also have clearly a new globalization of the Arctic, the linkage of Arctic natural resources to global markets, and I think Mika and his team have captured that pretty well. We also have a whole set, and we hear all the time, the Arctic Council in most venues, whole set of Arctic indigenous peoples issues. And then finally, of course, the Arctic is linked to the world in geopolitics, but linked also regionally in an intriguing geopolitical dimension of the acidification of the seabed. How this all plays out to 2035, how these interrelate with overlaying technological change is what Mika has also added to this equation, is hugely complex. Lots of wild cards, I think, is the message. Just one point about the shipping, I think that Mika captures this well. Everyone that works on this problem in depth, particularly the maritime industry, sees no new globalization, no retooling of the global trade routes to the Arctic. What they see is new supplemental opportunities, and that's what Mika has pointed to. No one really believes we're going to take over all the trade that happens on the planet through the Panama Canal, even the new Panama Canal, and through the Suez Canal, even the new Suez Canal, I'll bet before 2035. So the Arctic shipping is an add-on, great opportunities, and certainly dominated by destinational shipping of Arctic natural resources to the planet. And no one really can forecast exactly what the niche markets might be for container shipping. Clearly there are opportunities, but all of this navigation is still seasonal. The place is ice covered, fully or partially, for 9.5 months a year, through the century and beyond. We know the ice is thinner, less extent, but it's still there, and it is a considerable barrier for transshipping. So I think Mika's approach to this as a supplemental, Arctic shipping in particular, as a supplemental to global shipping is right on the money. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Lawrence, do you have comments?
Sure. Like Lawson, I appreciated the touch of reality about the Northern Sea route, the statement that it would be always negligible relative to Suez and Panama traffic. That's absolutely true. I think when we plot these transits and talk about how the number of transits has increased 50% from the year before or what have you, it's just important to keep in mind that the total number going through that route for the entire shipping season is on the same scale as 1 day of traffic through the Suez Canal. And Suez operates year-round. So I appreciated that touch of pragmatism in the talk. I also appreciated what I think the talk does very well, which is to summon some of the excitement and passion about the future potentialities and opportunities that may lie in this region. Some pragmatic, others quite out there, like farming, for example, or space gateways and new technologies. This is exciting, and I think this benefits this community to have that kind of excitement. That said, there's also a risk that it plays into one of the broader problems that the Arctic has globally, which is that it is perceived as somehow this blank slate, that it is perceived as this place that the Arctic is what you make it, when in fact it isn't. It's very, it's, as all in this room know, there are many very real limitations of the place. It's extremely well governed, has been for a long time. This is not a palette, not quite the blank slate that sometimes this kind of excitement can go too far. So the limitations and the very serious problems shouldn't be glossed over, nor the interests of the people who have lived there for millennia. So I hope we can maintain that balance in this panel as we balance both the exciting opportunities with the very pragmatic concerns moving forward.
Yeah, there was one concern that President Sauli Niinisto from Finland this morning brought up regarding the trade restrictions with Russia. And you mentioned one scenario that you didn't go into deeply, the militarized scenario. So what's your view on that?
Well, our view is that the militarized scenario is the least robust of our eight. What we're thinking is that when we think about the Arctic in terms of security, well, it's more about SNR. It's more about search and rescue. It's more about securing the development of the Arctic rather than securitization for a military purpose. So this fifth scenario, which is the militarization of the Arctic, of course, Russia leads the way because Russia has tremendous expertise in the Arctic. Russia has been an Arctic country since 1478. That's kind of what I say every time. So Russia is here, America is over there, but America doesn't put any money in the Arctic right now. And I think we didn't get the chance to hear Amira Pab just before, and that's sad, but at the same time, we kind of know where America is going. That is, well, the Congress is not really willing to invest the money it would need if America would compete with Russia over time in the Arctic. And there's something else. The other factor is China. China, of course, wants to secure its territory. But China has a different geostrategic perspective from ours as Westerners. China believes, it's hard to put it this way, but you get the idea. In China, you have a lot of academics who believe that the Arctic can be a tool to a securitization of the Chinese territory. They believe that through the Arctic and the Antarctic, you could control space, or you could have actually a better hand on what's happening in space. And that's where the thinking comes in. They believe that they cannot compete with the West, broadly speaking, in terms of air, land, and sea. So they think about going up north or up above, up to space to actually make sure that their militarization
Now we're going into the next session, basically, which
Awesome.
is the Arctic from space. So if we can keep it to the planet, sort of. And do you comment? Can you comment on the
Yeah, sure.
military aspect?
I didn't hear Japan and Korea in the discussion, and I suspect, having dealt with both countries in a wide range of issues, that they'll be maritime players themselves. Maybe niche markets, clearly move in natural resources, but if you look today in the world, who's building Arctic-going ships, it's Korea. It's not China. It's not even Japan. Japan has built a few ice-breaking ships, but it's really Korea has a niche market here. So my guess is that there are a full range of players. There are a lot of wild cards, of course, as there are in doing the scenarios process and trying to kind of look at the future, from nuclear energy to indigenous issues, and we don't know when they're going to pop up. One popped up recently, right? Oil today is $85 a barrel. Very few people suspected that it would be so low today. When just a comment about the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment the Arctic Council produced, during the length of this study, we started out with this study, $140 a barrel. When we ended the study, it was $57. Just that one driver would affect marine transportation in the Arctic. Real wild card, very dynamic. So there are lots of wild cards, and we're having them even today.
Lawrence?
Well, and some of these wild cards aren't being discussed enough, in my opinion. For example, Senator Murkowski referred today of the two Arctics in the context of development, a well-developed Arctic versus the remainder, which is in desperate need of infrastructure, improved infrastructure, for example. But there's another two Arctics that's spoken about very little, the marine versus the land. I mean, the Arctic has a lot of land, and most of the talks and the media hype that we read about and the reports really focus on the marine future of this place. And that's probably appropriate because the future of this place is marine, because the benefits that transportation, for example, will not be realized on land. In fact, quite the opposite. The landscape will be debilitated by future climate change in response in the high Arctic to threat of thawing permafrost, especially places that have a lot of ice in the ground. This is damaging to infrastructure. It also poses a potential long-term threat to the planet from increased methane emissions. And more broadly, even south of the Arctic, to temporary winter roads, which as people who live in, say, northern Alberta know very well, there are many industries and human activities that can only happen thanks to these winter roads. So there's a dichotomy there that one half of which is too often missing from the debates in this room. And it will impact, particularly with regard to resource extraction, that will enter the picture as, for example, in Russia, in the Russian Far East, if those commodities are to go to China, they need to be transferred from the land to the ports. So a broad-based discussion, I think, would be beneficial as opposed to focusing too much on certain areas.
Yeah, Lawson?
Just a quick comment about, we'll hear throughout this conference this loaded term, confusing term, infrastructure. What does it mean? But clearly there's a need for public-private partnerships. I mean, it's very clear, because the Arctic states themselves are not going to develop all of this infrastructure, particularly related to even marine safety and environmental protection. It has to be in union with the commercial world.
And some people actually say, Lawrence, that we're now entering a cooling period because we've seen the sea ice grow 2013, 2014. What's your response to that?
Oh, I'd be glad to speak to that. I'm sure Don Gunnar Winther may later in his presentation as well. Over the short term, Arctic climate is a bit like the stock market. It will have corrections and pauses and so forth. There are many drivers of climate system and sea ice conditions in the Arctic. But the secular trend, the long-term trend of increased warming of the planet's energy balance, which is amplified in the Arctic, is absolutely unequivocal. The physics of the greenhouse warming have been known since a Swedish chemist named Svante Arrhenius worked them out longhand in 1893. If you increase the concentration of these gases in the atmosphere, on average, the temperature must go up. And so these short-term pauses, it should not, and it's almost irresponsible to overplay them in face of the long-term.
Okay, that's short-term. We were talking long-term, and you were mentioning huge investments coming in. So if we just go back to your report, where would you foresee that these investments come from mostly?
Well, going back to the climate change question for just 1 second, this is one of the scenarios we've tested, actually. We work, as I said, out of 8 scenarios, 7 of which are based on the idea that Larry just mentioned, that the Arctic will grow over time, that the Arctic will melt, over time. And the 8th scenario is, could there be a backward trend, a long-term backward trend? Well, of course, if that were to happen, well, a lot of investment would not happen in the Arctic, but still, the Arctic would remain a territory of innovation for many reasons. Going back to your question on investments, well, you have 3 territories that are actually right now the ones who are capturing the most of the investments for the Arctic. Of course, there's the Russian coast. The Russian coast, the investments are geoeconomically driven. That means they are driven by the state to the private. Then you have America, Canada, in which, in the mining sector, the hydrocarbon sector, and so on, you have a private initiative because there is a market. And then you have other kind of areas in the Arctic, like Greenland or like Iceland, in which you have kind of a mixed approach. There is a top-to-bottom approach in some sectors, and there's a private initiative in other sectors. So that's what we see. There's not a dichotomy, but a trichotomy when it comes to investments in the Arctic and the way they come up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, on back to the indigenous issue and the sort of public-private sort of partnerships. And I was wondering, because if we look at the investments here going on in Iceland and what I can tell is happening in Greenland, what people can actually learn is usually coming in from the outside. We don't have the necessary expertise to venture into new industries. So I'm part of the indigenous population here in Iceland. So at least to me here, it's very appealing to see internationals coming in and participating, so this transfer of knowledge can take place and we can actually grow into new industries. Do you have a view on how that happens elsewhere in the Arctic? Lawrence?
Well, you put your finger on yet another real challenge for this region, and that is education and access to educated, skilled workforce. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the northern populations, the Nordic countries are in great shape. We have good universities, a highly educated workforce, but you look around the rest of the circumpolar north, and there's just a real problem there. And the young people are not staying in town. They're moving south. They're moving to the big cities. And how are we to are some of these visions to actually be realized when this is happening? So it's a key issue.
Lawson?
Just to add that we probably need new funding mechanisms, new opportunities for funding, particularly infrastructure in coastal Arctic communities, new venues and new areas where this funding can take place in a cooperative Arctic arrangement.
There was some mentioning by the gentleman from OECD, Mr. Gurria, that there was an abundance of oil now, and we should sort of do away with fossil fuels altogether. After reading your book, Lawrence, that's not quite the conclusion you came to. Can you comment on that?
Well, sure. It's not the conclusion. It wasn't my conclusion. It's just a simple looking at the facts of reality. I mean, look, we all want we all would love, who in this room would not love to see a truly carbon neutral planet where we've removed our dependence on oil, for example, so that we're no longer burning this amazing resource, but actually reserving it for the plastics and polymers of the future. There will come a day when our descendants will go, "You burned it for heat?" Who doesn't want that? But when you look at the near term, in the next several decades ahead, it's very unrealistic to see a way in which we can fully wean ourselves off of this dependency in the near term.
And just the reality of in the Arctic, we have 2 Arctic states that where their GNP is tied to Arctic natural resources, particularly oil and gas, Norway and Russia, and other Arctic states that are moving in that direction. So to sense that you could somehow cut that off, and that development and that investment, particularly in oil and gas in the Arctic, focused on oil and specifically, it is maybe not in the realm of plausibility if you're talking scenarios.
I might add something on that. We've been working extensively out of the Global Energy Outlook from BP. And what they say is that by 2035, the market share of hydrocarbons in the global energy demand would go down from 86% in 2014 to 81% in 2035. So I'm just going your way. This is a reality that we have to make sure we understand and we apply in our studies. I would add one more thing as well on what you just touched upon before. When it comes to social issues in the Arctic, education is one, but there are also many other things. There is women's rights, there is suicide of the youth, food insecurity, health. There are so many other things that are actually happening in the Arctic that are bad thing for which people should, become activists for, but they just don't, because they believe that, hey, it's Canada, it's a developed country, something's happening. This thing doesn't happen. There's no suicide in Canada. There is no problems of access to health in Canada, and so on. Even in Iceland, I've seen a survey several years ago saying that 42% of women in Iceland had experienced a sexual assault in some way. Could be from minor to a full-on rape. So I'm sorry to talk about this right now, but this is a major issue in the Arctic and across the Arctic as well.
Yeah, but fortunately, at least what the Icelandic studies shows are that things are getting better.
Yeah.
These are real issues and they need to be addressed, but it seems that we're on the right path. But just for the last few minutes, I would like to open the floor to questions, if there are any. Yeah, there's one question here. If you could please introduce yourself and come with a short question. Thank you.
Theo Kongsbach, Nordic citizen and resident of northern Iceland. Well, it's rather a comment. One of the problems is this idea of remoteness, that the Arctic is remote. I think one of the problems is that this is remote. The Arctic villages and the Arctic in itself is not remote. It's we who have to learn to rethink what remoteness is, to think the metropoles as remote, not the small villages. They're not remote. So in a sense, if we should create, so that was a reference to to Kennedy. Now we can take a reference to Martin Luther King. I have a dream. But a dream is that the Arctic should not be constructed on metropolitan models, but on village models, basically. As the president addressed this morning, we are like a village. But of course, it's just a metaphor. We are not a village. We are pretty metropolitan, and people here are pretty metropolitan in the way of speaking about that.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you for that comment, please.
Good morning. Is this working?
Yep, it's working.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Rachel Johnston, University of Akureyri in Iceland. I was very interested in the optimism in your presentation and all the opportunities the Arctic might be offering as change comes to us. However, your company is called Polarisk, and I wondered if you might say a few words about where you thought the major losses might lie. You mentioned, for example, the possibility of settled agriculture in Greenland, and I wonder what that meant for the dog sledders who simply can't hunt when there's no ice. Thank you.
So I guess that's one for me. Thank you very much, Rachel. When it comes to farming, we think that what we've seen happening is that in Greenland you have a lot of people who now get to new kinds of farming. Basically, they can grow people grow bananas now in Greenland. So that's for a domestic use. But over time, as many countries like France, Germany, and so on build other kinds of farming industries, well, Greenland could actually be supplemental and bring something else to the global market. So that's just on your example of farming. I forgot what the first part of your question was. I think it was about the risks, right? So of course our company's bay is called Polarisk because, well, it's polar risk, right? Obviously, that's not even a play on words. But it also means polar in Norwegian, if I'm correct. So what we try to say is that there are risks in the Arctic, and there are obvious risks in operating right now in the Arctic. And these risks can be operational risks. We're going to be seeing that in the shipping, mining sessions and all that. But there are also many political risks, and that's what we focus on. So in the report, we have a specific assessment of which industries are subject to what kind of political risks. Micro-political risk or macro-political risks. Well, you find the two across the Arctic, but from one country to another, or even from one region to another within the same Arctic country, well, you don't find the same risk. So I'm going to stick to that broad answer.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I get the message that our time is up, so I just had time for one last question.
Thank you. I also appreciated your optimism with the future, but I also work at the North Slope Borough School District as the director of curriculum. We are rewriting our curriculum for our students, but we have probably less than 200 14-year-olds entering the 9th grade, their secondary school this year. And those students are not so optimistic about their future. And so my question to those who are talking about the economic and political development and even military development, what can such great powers as you do to help our students who are spread across 89,000 square miles of Arctic tundra? How can all of us come together to bring this sense of optimism and future to these students who want to continue to subsistence hunt, want to live in their villages, do not want to leave and go to the university, but they like using their iPhones and they like using their computers, and so they have both the technology and the traditional ways of being. How can we bring those students with us without destroying their traditional ways?
If you start, Mika.
Just a short answer. The best answer is to be pragmatic. We cannot sell dreams to people. We have to be pragmatic in our approaches. We have to be pragmatic when it comes to our numbers. And we have to say, this is possible, this is not possible. So that is the key thing, I believe, in the Arctic discussion right now.
Last comments?
I would just add, expanding the example, I think you said you come from the North Slope Borough where things perhaps are tough, but actually at the circumpolar scale, Barrow has been a real success through its regional corporations, land claim settlements, and there is some brightness of future there for people that is not shared by some indigenous peoples of the Siberian East and Russian Far East, for example. So spreading of some of these models to other parts of the Arctic would be beneficial to many young people.
Yeah, just a quick point that relates also to the first question. The Arctic is no longer remote, and these communities are not remote in this connected world. Maybe they are physically or geographically, but even that is suspect. So this new connection provides new opportunities for all the students, and they're connected too. So that information flow will change many perspectives around the whole of the Arctic.
Okay, so gentlemen, thank you very much for a very interesting and good discussion. So thank you.